So, Power BI meets programmability. That is our conversation today. A little bit about me. I am a senior and data and analytics consultant over at 3Cloud. I'm also on the board for PassMN and a co-organizer for the Lexington Data Technology Group. I also author on Data on Wheels, and me and my dad just launched Data on Rails, which is a blogging platform. Happy to talk through that offline at some point if that's something you're interested in, getting into blogging, getting into sharing your knowledge with the data community, and practicing those kind of soft skills on communication with things you're learning in your day-to-day roles. At a high level, my experience includes implementing and managing enterprise level Power BI. That usually includes training teams on best practices, learning new coding languages, and building templates for scalable analytics. As we all know, a lot of BI solutions start out as POCs, proofs of concepts, and taking it to that next level of integrating it with your existing applications and integrating it with your existing tech stack is something I love doing and helping companies achieve. There are a couple links here. I'll have them at the end of the presentation as well. And I will also show you guys the link to the GitHub. And the GitHub folder will have this presentation, the zip file for the C# application I'm going to use, as well as the Power BI and the Excel that powers the Power BI. So if you wanted to rebuild this all from scratch on your own, more than welcome to. The code is all there. I will say the only limitation is you will need a Power BI premium workspace to do this in. And I'll get into all that in a second. So just to back up a little bit and kind of put us in a context of why this is important. In 2015, companies spent an average of $7.4 million on data-driven initiatives. Seems like a lot, but within 7 years, that went up to 12.3 million, with half of the executives that were surveyed estimating that that budget will end up increasing. So that's a 40% increase in budget, and it highlights a clear priority on cultivating data-driven culture. We hear that buzzword a lot. We hear data-driven decision-making a lot, especially in this industry where people are really focused on turning that money they're spending on storing data into actionable insights that help them make decisions. So with that in mind, obviously, reporting plays a large role in that, but so does giving that reporting to your business users and making it something they can understand. I've seen a lot of reports come out that I end up reshaping because the people who are actually using them don't know what any of the visuals mean. They don't know how to use them to actually answer any questions they have. And so they end up exporting to Excel and making their own. That's not something you want to see. So some of the stuff we're going to talk about today is going to go into how to easily make scalable changes to an enterprise reporting platform that essentially your end users can configure on their own. So that brings us to why are we talking about C#? It's a great question, especially for Power BI developers. I don't know many of us who have had to learn C#. I don't know many of us who have looked at C# and be like, yes, that's what I want to learn next. Typically, it's Python, it's R, pretty much any other language besides C#. So the reason we're talking about C# is a lot of times that's what is used in .NET applications. So if you think about your company's web page, you think about what portal your business users are likely logging in. So for example, in logistics, what might happen is I've got this portal I log into to check the status of my loads to see, hey, this one got picked up, this one's late, so on and so forth. All of that is typically powered by a solution package in the backend. And I'll show you kind of a really simple one that we're going to use for this. After this, if you take that code, you can basically say, I made my own C# application. I would not put that on your resume because people will think that you know a lot more than you do. But it does help when you're talking to, especially app development teams, about what it takes to bring your reporting into the hands of business users. So I'll kind of go into that a little bit. BI and app dev, I think we're better together, honestly. And I think that's where BI is headed, and it's where app dev is headed. What you end up with is a lot of UI designers and UX designers informing BI decision making on visualizations, on how they're going to lay out how a report works. I find that storytelling within Power BI often mimics UX experiences. So, for example, if I've got a bunch of visuals on a page, a UX designer can tell me at a glance, hey, nobody's going to look at this percentage of your visuals because their eyes don't go and process all of that. So there's things we can learn from each other on the visualization side, but also on the back end. So AppDev has a long history in building scalable, adaptable, and programmable situations or classes, different programs. And I think from BI side, we can take those and learn from them. So I'll kind of go into examples in the demo, but at a high level, there's a lot of things that AppDev does well, especially in regards to, hey, I'm a business user, and let's say I'm in finance, and I've got 12 GL codes for one customer. And let's say I have another customer who has 15, and they want them all called something else. Well, as an app developer, I would probably build something that was more plug and play, right? Where they can customize how that GL code looks, they can customize how it feels, and customize the data types. Unfortunately, when you do that and you have something like a unified data model for your BI reporting, what'll happen is you end up making a different report for every single customer. And anytime they change that GL code, you have to download your PBIX file and grab the new columns, right? And if you have a company of that services maybe 400, 500 customers, what'll happen is you typically will have a BI team of maybe 5 to 10 if you're lucky. Those 10 people can't sit around and only service the finance team reporting for your customers for GL codes alone, right? So what we're going to talk about today will solve that in other use cases where you want the flexibility that app development has within your BI platform. So just some important terms, because I'll be referencing these a lot, so it's good to just kind of have them in the back of your mind. Tabular object model, I'm going to call it TOM a lot, because frankly, that's less syllables than tabular object model. Essentially what that is it exposes the native tabular metadata behind the scenes in Power BI, SSAS, AAS, and it supports programming these tabular models. So if you think about it, and we will dig deep into a tabular object model, it's everything from a column, it's everything from a measure, it's got all of your hierarchies are built into the tabular object model, any translations that you have, so on and so forth. If it's anything that you could access that wasn't the visual layer, it exists inside of Tom. I do think, a little side note, I do think this is part of why it's hard to do CI/CD with Power BI, is because they are separate, right? So the tabular object model has C# classes, and it's built with that more in mind, whereas the visual layer is all built in JSON. So I think that eventually we'll get to the point where we can track both sets of changes, but there is a lot of documentation on there on even tracking your changes using exports of the tabular object model. Again, not the same as being able to track what visuals changed, but it does give you some clarity into if any of your measures have changed or if you're doing calculated columns, those sort of things. Analysis services. This is the analytical engine, or you might have called it Vertipack, especially if you're a big Power BI person. That provides a semantic data model for reports and applications. So analysis services is important because a lot of what I'm about to show you was built for analysis services and for SSAS, which is part of why it doesn't include that visual layer. It was built so that it could integrate with your existing applications. Pretty neat. I think it's a different perspective on report building, and we'll dig in. All right, the last one, XMLA endpoint. So this is XML for analysis. If you've ever wondered what XMLA, the differences between that and XML. That's the only difference. It communicates between applications and the analysis service engine. Data over XMLA is fully encrypted. This is important, especially if you are integrating it with an application or if you're trying to follow different privacy laws. It definitely helps that that's natively built in. It does require Power BI Premium or Premium per user workspace. This is the caveat that I wanted to call out. Uh, Everything else exists in Power BI no matter what. The free Power BI has the tabular object model and analysis services engine behind the scenes, but you can only access it in the service via the XMLA endpoint. So that is kind of the paywall that Microsoft has built in. They do need to make money, I understand. It would be cool if we could allow this for everyone, but I do think that if you're looking at an enterprise BI solution, chances are you already have a Power BI premium license and you're already using it effectively. So just something to keep in mind as we go through this as well. All right, the moment you've all been waiting for, demo time. Exit out of here. All right, so this is going to look pretty scary at first, so I'm going to walk through just a couple of setup options for you guys. To start, obviously, I do have a premium workspace. So I just do premium per user for any of my demos. It's 20 bucks a month. If this is something your company wants to do in order to investigate if Power BI Premium is right for them, I highly recommend it. It's a pretty low cost to entry if you're just looking to test some things out, especially for POCs like this. You'll notice that I've got one workspace in here that's on purpose. We're going to run through this code and I'm going to have it return all of the data sets in my workspace. You can probably, your head's probably already thinking, oh, that would be so helpful if we were doing tracking or management of my entire BI enterprise solution. You are correct. And a lot of people have built out some tools based off of that. You might have heard of Tabular Editor. Tabular Editor behind the scenes is using Tom. So there's a lot we can learn from it. And if you've ever wanted to take the outputs from Tabular Editor and put them into a database or put them into something you can report on more easily, the code I'm walking through is very similar to theirs as well. So something to keep in mind. I will also, at the end of the presentation, send out this link as well. You can find it under AnitCirc 12. It's my first name backwards plus 12, and then data on wheels. And I've got a folder that's going to have all of the documentation for Power BI meets programmability. So as we go into it, if you're curious about how any of this is set up, go ahead and dig in. My email will also be at the end, and I do check it pretty often. So feel free to email me with any questions following up after this. So just so you guys know, I have nothing behind my sleeves or up my sleeves, whatever the phrase is. I have my Power BI desktop report here. And so we're going to be referencing both side by side, what's in the service versus what's in my desktop. What we're going to do in C# is only going to reference or only going to change what's in the service via the XMLA endpoint. So I'm going to publish this right now. We're going to overwrite my existing one. And throughout the course of the presentation, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to change a column name. We're going to change a measure. We're going to change and create a column, create a measure. And then also, I want us to get into hierarchies. And if we have time, we'll go through translations because there's some cool stuff you can do with translations that is a little bit off the wall as far as use case. All right, so getting started, I don't want this to be super intimidating for you guys. So I do have a blog post series about this as well that goes through my struggles of setting it all up. I can send that link over as well. Essentially, what you're doing is building a C# application, right? So it's going to have a lot of files in it. If you download the zip file, you'll notice there's multiple things in there. When you go to run this, you're going to open the .sln because that's the solution that you're going to edit. So if we look in here, you'll notice that we're using a couple of things. We're using system, which is pretty standard, but we're also using this Microsoft Analysis Services tabular. So this is the portion that your app dev team is going to be the most interested in. They will need to add that into their existing classes. So just something to keep in mind. Obviously, if they are really familiar with the tabular object model to begin with, there's tons of documentation on it. They'll be able to read this and kind of know what's going on and how to incorporate it. One gotcha that I noticed pretty quickly, you can have just class program. You definitely want to have internal class program if you plan on running this multiple times for a POC, something that you learn the hard way. The static void, some of these are standard practice inside of C# applications. If you want to dig in, there is a lot of documentation and a lot of videos on YouTube about what each of these mean. I'm not going to go into it because that's not the fun part of this presentation. So we're not doing intro to C#. With that in mind, I am going to keep this limited to a use case where I'm going to log into my Azure AD every time we run this code. There are other connection strings you can do that use service principals, because obviously your application, you never want that tied to a specific user. I don't have that set up for this demo, mostly because it also helps us get a visual representation of that login and of that authentication every time we go through it, or some of that encryption work that we were talking about. You'll notice here I've got my workspace connection. This is happy coding. Again, it's formatted based off of let me grab the workspace settings. So if you come into workspace settings and you go under premium, you can grab this workspace connection string here as well. Pretty standard stuff. So if I come down here, I'm going to have my connection string look at this workspace connection. And then Power BI, the tabular object model, it renames a couple of things. So it's good to keep this in mind as we go along, because I'm going to call things databases that you probably know that as data sets, and I'm going to call things servers that you probably know as workspaces. So think of this as if it was built into SSMS, for example. Your server is going to be your workspace. Underneath that, you're going to have databases, and those are going to be your data sets that power your Power BI reports. So that's kind of the nomenclature here. If you have any questions about that, let me know. But yeah, if you see that everywhere, we're not connecting to an external database. We are just connecting to the analysis services data engine. So after I connect to my server, the next thing is going to be listing out all of my data sets. So again, database, data set, same thing. What I'm going to have it do is a loop, and this is one of the biggest PowerPoints well, I'm going to stick with PowerPoints, but biggest PowerPoints of C# and other applications is they're able to loop. So as we go along, think about that, right? How can I loop through these things we're doing for multiple customers, for multiple workspaces? It's very easy to code in and very easy to ramp up from that perspective. So what I want it to do is for every single one of my data sets, I'm going to have it write for me the ID, the name, the compatibility level, and the last time it was updated. So in our case, there's only going to be one, but it's still good to see these things. And this will run at the beginning of every time we do another example. I know for a fact that this is my database ID, but if you're running through this and you're not sure what your database ID is, you can stop the script here and just get the list and then grab the ID from here. Again, this is all really highly programmable. I have made it hard-coded on purpose so that this presentation doesn't decide to run through everything in my tenant. So definitely easy to scale out, but did want to call that out. I have it also narrowed down to a table. So we're going to be adding things to a specific table. So what I want it to do is grab all the tables for me and if it's hidden or not. A couple of other things would be naming. So I'm going to create a variable for product. So I have a product table and I have a measure table. So I've created a couple of variables for those that I can use later on in the script. Obviously, you can change these as you need. And again, everything's programmable. I am hard coding so that it limits the scope, and I can be very direct on what I want to do in this. Let's see here. So the last thing I want to do is I'm going to have it list out my columns in the product table, and then I want to list out my measures in the product table. And the reason why I'm having it list all of these things out is because later in this presentation, we're going to be changing them. So it's nice to see current state, and then we'll run it again to see output. All right, I think that's enough talking. We'll go into these as we get to them. But for now, let me go ahead and run this. We should get our Azure pop-up. Go. Awesome. All right. So looking at this, you can see it ran pretty quick, as it should. There's only one data set in there. We've got a few columns or a few tables in here. So I've got my product, measures, calendar, and sales. You'll notice that none of these are hidden. The reason for that is I actually have the auto calendar turned off in my report. So if I go to calendar real quick, you can see that there is no date hierarchy. If I had the hierarchy turned on, what would happen is we would then get a hidden table in the back end. This is also useful for if you are building out, if you're trying to figure out why a data model is so slow, you can come in here and figure out which tables are hidden and which ones are not that might be bloating your data model. You'll notice we've got row number. That's something Power BI builds in as part of the Vertipaq engine to help things run faster. I've got one existing culture, and then I've got some hierarchies. Awesome. And then I put a little script complete at the bottom, so I know that it worked. But so far, so good. We've got an initial set. We know we can connect. So this section is going to be for deleting columns and measures. I'm not going to demo this one because we're going to skip right ahead to adding columns and measures. And the adding columns and measures is going to have a delete function built in, so I can run it multiple times without it telling me that the column already exists. So you'll notice even in this script, there's some comments in here like, all right, let's see if this column exists. If it does exist, then go ahead and tell me it exists and then remove it and then tell me it got deleted. There's a lot of bloat in this code that's made so that you and I can understand what it's doing. So feel free to look at this and learn from each of these sections, but I am going to skip this one. So jumping down to adding columns and measures, I'm going to uncomment out all of this. What this is going to do is it's going to look for a column called testing on our product table. So if I look at my existing one, you'll notice that on my product table, there is not a column called testing. So what we're going to do is we're going to add one. And what I want it to do is look at the source column product. In the next section, we're actually going to look at adding a column with DAX, but to start out with, I just want to have it look at an existing column. This is also where you could change it. So if you have a source that is changing column names, or you have a source that's changing or adding columns, what you can do within a .NET application is have that plug in as a variable here, depending on what you need. So pretty slick stuff and definitely useful for what you're trying to build later. So I'm just going to have it tell us, hey, column got created. Awesome. The next thing I want to do is grab my measures. So let's make a new measure called test measure. I obviously don't have a test measure yet. So I'm going to have it just say, hello there. Now, if you're a Star Wars fan, you might have instantly thought how I thought, which is a good thing. I appreciate you. If not, I'm going to be the one person who tells you maybe watch the prequels. So hello there is going to be our first iteration of this measure. We're going to watch this one because when I refresh it, when we run the script the second time, it's going to flip to hello world. So it'll be fun to kind of see that in the service as well. And I'm sure you can kind of think through how that's going to be valuable, especially if you have one measure that needs to change in 400 reports. You could loop through and find that measure and swap out in all of those reports without downloading the PPIX file every time. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and run this. Awesome. So you'll notice that I've put some other scripts in here. So we've got column created, measure added. I wasn't as excited when I wrote that code. Maybe I should change that. And then script complete. Awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into this guy. And you'll notice that now it's refresh time. I haven't touched that refresh and it just aligned to my current time. That's because at the end of this script, it does an automatic refresh of the whole data set so that it can grab the data from that new column and pull it in. So if I come in here, I'm going to go ahead and go to my handy dandy XMLA interactions. And you'll notice I've turned on personalized visuals. That's because I don't want to have to hit the edit button every time. But to start out, we are going to go to edit and we're going to look at my product table. You'll notice we now have a column called testing. And like I said, didn't exist before. And I also am going to have a measure called test measure. So let's pull those into our table here. So if we look at test measure, it's hello world for the whole thing. It's exactly what I expect. And when I pull in testing, it's going to match my product table, my product column, because that's what I have it set up to do. Perfect. All right. So I think we're looking good there. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to my reading view. And going to go back to the script. There we go. So again, we're going to watch this. In the next iteration, what's going to happen is you'll see hello world instead of hello there. So keep an eye out for that. In this next section, we're going to go through adding columns and measures with DAX functions. Again, this is super powerful. This is where you're going to be able to update a large amount of measures or a large amount of calculated columns without necessarily having to go through every single data set that you have in your tenant. I've used this before because somebody decided that gross revenue now needed to include a tax amount. So that's the use case we're going to use here, is essentially adding a tax of 5% onto it. All right, so that's going to be our custom column. There's a few things to note in here. You'll notice, again, this is going to be on my table product. It's using that variable that we had defined earlier. I'm going to be looking up a column, list price with tax. It's not going to exist right now. We're going to make it, but if it already exists, I want it to let me know, hey, by the way, this column already exists. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. If it doesn't already exist, what I want it to do is make a new calculated column. Now, some of these things are a little tricky. There are what are called constructors in C#. And so there is a lot of documentation in the tabular object model Microsoft documentation about this, but typically you have to do your Google searches toward analysis services. It's pretty hard to find if you're searching with Power BI as your keyword. So just a little call out there. And part of why I've included so many examples in this is so that you know how to do these different items. Obviously, I am not an advocate for calculated columns normally because I would rather you push that upstream into the M code or into the SQL. But for this example, we'll just add a calculated column. It's a pretty small data set, won't impact performance as much. You'll notice a few things in here. We're going to give it a name. We give it a data type. We'll give it an expression. So this is going to be, as you might have guessed, DAX. And then a lineage tag. Now, the reason why I gave it a lineage tag is so that I can reference it again later. So Power BI Desktop makes an auto-generated lineage tag that looks more like a GUI. When you make things via the tabular object model right now, it doesn't give you a lineage tag. So if you want to call it later in your code, what would happen is you would have to call it by name with all these contains names that I'm doing. Obviously, a more efficient way would be to call it by lineage tag. So just something to keep in mind. You'll see a lineage tag in a lot of places here because I'm explicitly giving it a lineage tag. After all of that, what you have to do in the tabular object model is I'm going to make this object called column testing, but then I have to actually tell it to add that column onto my existing table product or my existing product table. So that's kind of where that script is. And actually at the end of the code, I'll just kind of jump down a little bit. You might notice here we've got table product is a full refresh, like I had mentioned before. But then there's also this model refresh. So what this model refresh does is it takes anything like adding a column into a table and refreshes the schema. If you've ever deleted a column from your source table and then tried to refresh in Power BI, you know the pain of it basically telling you, hey, not cool. Like we were expecting this column. I know you're not using it anywhere in your report, but we were expecting it in your schema and we need it to be named the exact same. And I need it to be exactly how it was. What this allows you to do is basically overwrite what it expects to see. So pretty cool. Just wanted to call that out. You'll always need save changes as the last line of code. This took me a long time to figure out. I kept trying to put it sooner, but weirdly enough, you have to refresh and then save the changes. Not entirely sure why it's built that way, but I know it works. All right, so if I go back up here, we talk through column. If I go to measure, you'll see that we're going to make a new one called DAX measure example. And this is going to be product cost plus 100. Pretty simple. The idea here being, hey, I've got this measure and I just need to tweak it a little bit in every single report. If I had this built for multiple reports in this workspace, we could loop through every single report and update this measure. So pretty cool stuff. I'm going to go ahead and run this so we can see it. Awesome. So you notice I added we've got a column exists call out now. We've got a measure exists call out now. We've got calculated column created and our DAX measure added. Let's see if these things actually happened in here. So you'll notice we already flipped to hello world. No, so it's not hello there anymore. Pretty cool stuff. So you can see that it does just change on the visual side. It didn't used to. You used to have to refresh your browser. So pretty cool to see this. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and we're going to add in a couple of things. You'll notice that we've got my test measure, which we already had. Let me remove that. If I go to product now, you'll notice that we don't have our column. So my measure changed automatically without me having to refresh the cache. Unfortunately, you do still need to refresh the cache in order to pick it up here. So let me go in here again. And if I grab another column, go to product, and we should have, here we go, list price with tax is our new column that we just made. So I'll grab that just so we can see it working. Ta-da! Pretty exciting stuff, you know? And then I'm going to go ahead and pull in our new column or a new measure as well. So DAX measure example was our other one. And if you're not familiar with personalized visuals, highly recommend looking them up. It is a great way to give your business users something that they can adjust without you constantly having to reorganize. And also doesn't give them full reins to edit your entire report. So yeah, pretty slick. We've got a couple of new columns and measures, and we saw this, let's see, this went back to hello there. That is not what I was expecting. There we go. Huh. Maybe I'm going crazy. I definitely saw hello world, so let's take a look at that again. But if I grab my DAX example. All right, well, I will look at that. I was pretty excited to see I didn't have to refresh to see it, but now I'm wondering if it's doing some stuff I didn't want it to. So let's go back to the code here real quick, and we're going to go back up to measure and just triple check. So we've got deleting, got if the measure exists, go ahead and go with no. Oh, you know what? I did that backwards. So if the table contains test measure, it's going to do hello there. If the table does not contain this measure, then we're going to have hello world. So I'm making problems for myself now. Sorry about that. All right, so just in case, I'm going to change it again just because I want to make sure it works. So I'm going to change this to hello, happy coders. And we're going to see how this goes. All right, so the next section, let's see where I'm at in time. Okay. It's hierarchies. So this, I think, is especially powerful. If you are dealing with things like customer hierarchies or employee hierarchies, for example, where somebody can change managers or maybe there's different levels of management. So, for example, I've seen this a lot actually with GL codes. It's probably my biggest example of this, where so-and-so will have 6 GL codes and this other customer is going to have 10. Well, now I need to account for that in my hierarchies, dynamically, preferably, right? I don't want to build 3 different hierarchies for these different customers because they're inevitably going to change them at the next fiscal year. So what we can do with this is essentially your application can take input from your end users and it can take it and plug it in to these different sections here and essentially recreate the hierarchy anytime it changes. So pretty cool. There are some limitations with it, so we'll go over that. Unfortunately, it does not change the visual layer at all. As you might have heard before, they're disconnected, right? The visual layer and the tabular object model are inherently disconnected, unfortunately. So if I change a hierarchy in my tabular object model, it looks right when I'm hitting the edit button, but it won't change my visual to accommodate that hierarchy. So just something to keep in mind. Not a huge problem if you have the personalized visuals where people can go in and add them. I find that people are really willing to do that, especially if they already went into another application and added it. As long as it has the same name, they're usually happy to pull that in themselves. All right, so let's kind of dig in here on what this one is doing. So essentially, I have an existing hierarchy. You'll notice I've got this category hierarchy, goes from category to subcategory. Pretty simple. We're going to make some changes. So what we're going to do first is we're going to flip them, really. We're going to change the order. So the ordinal is what's known as the sort order, essentially. And typical, it starts at 0, right? So if I have an ordinal of 1, and that's the only thing I have in here, Power BI does not like that. You have to have an ordinal of 0 somewhere in there. So just something to keep in mind. You'll notice I've made a couple of variables again. So what I've done is say, hey, the category level, I found the lineage tag. I want to go ahead and I want to just make that an easier variable than calling this entire lineage tag. This is, again, where you could program this, right? Because we've got these lineage tags. We're calling them earlier up in the script, and I'll point them out when we run this one again. Pretty easy to find, pretty easy to get, and plug and play as needed. I also wanted to tell me, hey, by the way, we renamed and reordered your categories. So let's go ahead and rename these. So you'll notice that I've got name category and I've got subcategory. Let's just see. Yeah, so that matches our existing category. What I'm going to do is actually change this guy. So we're going to change subcategory to subcategory test, and we will see how that looks. Next step we're going to do is we're going to add a new level to the hierarchy if it doesn't already exist. So what I'm looking for is in my levels of this hierarchy category, I'm going to go ahead and look for the column model. All right, if it already exists, I just wanted to tell me it exists. I don't need to do anything with it. If it doesn't exist, I'm going to make a new level. So similar to columns, you might have remembered we have to make the column and then add it to the table and then refresh the model. It's similar with levels and hierarchies. You have to make the level. So you'll notice we have the name, the ordinal, the column that it's grabbing from, and I'm adding the lineage tag to make it easier to reference. And then I'm adding that level into the hierarchy. So just trying to walk you guys through all the steps that need to happen before it will actually pick it up. Otherwise, what'll happen is you'll have this level hanging out there in the middle of nowhere. You'll never see it on the report until you add it to the existing hierarchy. So just something to keep in mind. Um, and then I have another script in here that's going to make a brand new hierarchy. So at the end of this, we should have a reordered hierarchy with a new level and then a brand new hierarchy. You can see where this would be useful, especially if you have different use cases where customers might need to make things on the fly. It's really nice to give them the ability to make a hierarchy as well. All right, and again, we've got our lineage tag. You'll notice I'm making the hierarchy, calling it a new hierarchy. I'm going to add it to my table product because again, I have to add it to the level up. The hierarchy lives on a table, which lives on a model. So I have to add the hierarchy to the table. Once I've done that, I can make my levels and then I can add my levels onto that hierarchy. So pretty cool stuff. What we're going to do is we're going to have model and then product in that order. So those will be our brand new hierarchy levels. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and run this guy again. Oh, and we got an issue. Oh, shoot. Yep. All right. This happens every time, and I always forget to change it back. So as part of the demo, I'm renaming my hierarchy, right? So I need to keep it with the original hierarchy name first, and then go back to the new one. So let me go ahead and cancel this one. So we've got this hierarchy. See, so we're renaming the hierarchy. I see why I have that note. So we're going to leave subcategory as is, and we're just going to rename our hierarchy from category hierarchy to category hierarchy rename. You can see where this might be useful if you have a standardized data set and so wants it called, banana hierarchy and someone else wants it called apple hierarchy. You can do that without necessarily making completely new data models for everyone. Especially if you have a standardized reporting package that you send to your customers or clients or divisions. So something to keep in mind there. Go ahead and try this again. And then now I have to remember to put the rename back in there. Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so a lot of stuff happened. We've still got our existing tables. We've got our hierarchy. You'll notice that now I've got levels added to new hierarchy, a hierarchy added. We've got hierarchies reordered, all kinds of fun stuff. But I also wanted you to see what you might have not seen before is these different columns here. Actually, I've called the lineage tag and I've asked it to script it out. So it's pretty easy to find, especially if you're taking this code and trying to apply it to something else for a POC. Run it in chunks, right? Like just like I'm doing here, grab these lineage tags and plug them in. Obviously, you can make it more dynamic, but usually for a POC, you really want your focus to be zeroed in. Otherwise, people can get really lost in the weeds or it can feel overwhelming to try and see all these changes at once. So just a little bit of unsolicited advice on that one. But let's go ahead and hop back into here. So you'll notice I already included my hierarchy. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh this. There we go. Hello, happy coders is what I wanted. So you see here we have something is wrong with the visual. That is not what I want to see, especially if I know I changed that hierarchy. You see how these rows are now undefined. The field's invalid. It's just not good all around. So essentially what has to happen is you delete them. And I think that that's less than ideal. I'm hoping that eventually we get the ability to overwrite existing visuals using the tabular object model or something like it. Right now, as far as I know, that's the only way to do it via XMLA. And we would need something that functioned within the XMLA in order for it to be programmable. But on the bright side, you can see we did get our category hierarchy renamed, and we did get it reordered, and we have our new model column. Awesome, glad that worked. And then I've also got a new hierarchy now with model and product. Pretty slick. So it does work, but it does break your visuals if you change a hierarchy in something like a matrix. It is unfortunate and I think quite annoying, but uh, just something to be aware of if that is something you want to use. I would recommend putting the personalized visuals on just because then your end users can change it themselves because they're likely going to be the ones who change the hierarchy to begin with. All right, we're going to save that. Alrighty. So I think I've got time to quickly go through translations and then still have time for questions. Translations is really cool because not only can you translate to another language, which is extremely useful, but you can also translate and rename things without rebuilding the data model. So if you know that your primary users, like for a lot of my reporting, a lot of my users or a lot of the companies I work with are only US based. So the only translation in the data model is ENUS. So what that means for me is I can overwrite something in the existing culture and have it change the name for only certain people. So let's go ahead and do that one real quick. I'll kind of walk you guys through this one. Translations is pretty complicated. So if it feels overwhelming, you are not alone. There's definitely documentation on this. I did do a whole blog on translations alone because, again, pretty complicated, but also really powerful. So with this one, you'll notice that we've got something called culture now. So cultures are the tabular object model way of saying translations. Um, you'll notice that we have a culture. The culture name that is going to be in this model is ENUS, but I want to list it out just in case there are multiple. So the next thing I'm going to do is create a variable called ENUS culture. What it's going to do is take a look at my data model and the cultures within it and grab the ENUS culture. The next thing I want to do is add a translation. So what the tabular object model does in the background is similar to kind of hierarchies or tables. We've got that top level of culture, and that's going to be how you define it from the model perspective. And then within that culture, you're going to get these different object translations. So for the object translation, you can pick a specific object or a specific column, specific measure, and overwrite it. Pretty fun. So what I'm going to do with this one is I'm going to narrow it down again because I don't want to change everything. So I'm going to make another variable called data column. And what this is going to do is it's going to go from my table product. I'm going to take my columns. I want to find SKU. Okay. It's a boring name. I want to change it to something more fun, at least for our purposes. But assume maybe there's probably a use case here where I have a customer who they want to call everything department, and I've got another one that wants to call everything circle, for example. Pretty annoying when you have to maintain two separate data models. Instead, what you could do is have a culture applied to different ones. So pretty cool. I'm going to make an object translation variable. And what that is going to do is take the ENUS culture that we defined above. I want to grab the object translations for my data column that I'm picking, the existing ones, and I'm going to grab the translated property. Now you'll notice I get some IntelliSense here in the blog post where I set this all up. It does tell you what extensions to install in Visual Studio to get these kind of tips, and I highly recommend it, especially if you're new. But all right, so the other thing to notice is you can only have one translation per entity per culture, which makes sense. Power BI needs to know what to call it. If I had two, if I had, hey, SKU, I want it to be called cool stuff, and I also want it to be called, I don't know, rad stuff. Well, that doesn't work because it doesn't know which one to pick. So what I have it do is check to make sure that the proposed translation is null. If it's not null, then I want it to tell me, hey, translation already exists for this culture and column combo, and remove that translation. So once that happens, then I'm making a new variable called overwrite translation. So you'll notice it's no longer going to be the proposed, and I'm making a new object translation called cool stuff. So we're gonna run this a couple times. I was having fun with it. So we've got what the first one is going to do, because we're not going to have a proposed translation for this column yet, is we're going to have it reply totally rad instead of skew. So I want you guys to see it because it's pretty neat. So with that in mind, I'm gonna go ahead and run this. Oh, and I forgot to uncomment out. I was wondering where that went. I've deprived you all of seeing our end results all the time. There we go. So list out end state is basically the same script we had above, but it shows you what anything we've changed would show up there. So what I'm going to do so that we can see it change is I'm going to come in here and actually add skew into my columns. So from product, I've got skew. Awesome. Go back to my reading view. All right. So now if I'm in here, go ahead and hit run. Oh, and remember, I forgot to change back to rename. This is where lineage tags are great, and I need to make this change to my code so I don't keep forgetting this. Here we go. Always improving, right? Constant iteration. There we go. All right, here we go. There we go. All right, so you'll notice something cool is we had already at the top listed out our existing culture as ENUS. It won't print anything for the existing translations because there weren't any. But you'll notice that now in our second section, it tells me, oh, by the way, you have a final translated object called totally rad. Awesome. All right, let's see it. But my column name hasn't actually changed in the model. So my column name is still skew. So I don't have to change any of my measures. I don't have to change any of my visuals because the base column is still the same name. So now if I come in here and we refresh, you'll notice it automatically changed in the visual. Pretty cool. I don't have to do anything. It's automatically overriding it to say totally rad. I will say if I had changed the name from skew to something else, it wouldn't override it in the visual. So you do have to keep the original name in the visual for it to overwrite. My favorite part is that it also shows up as totally rad in here. So from your end user's perspective, the column name has changed. But from the backend perspective of Power BI, where you've got all your measures, you've got maybe conditional format, a bunch of other things that might rely on that column name, it actually doesn't impact anything. So go ahead and exit out of there, and we'll run this one more time, and then I'll open up for questions. And I just want to see it change from totally rad to cool stuff. There we go. All right, so if I go back to my final translated object, you'll know that it now has identified like, hey, we had a translated object called totally rad. The translation already exists, so it deleted it, and then the final translated object is gonna be cool stuff. So let's see that in action. Cool stuff. There we go. All right, and I have talked for long enough. I'm gonna go back to this slide.